Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm very excited about this event. As Chairwoman McCormick said, I'd really like to thank the EAC staff. They did a great job getting this event together, and none of us would be here without that work. So I really just want to thank them again and say how much we appreciate their efforts. And I'm really excited about this panel. We've been hearing about the 2020 election for quite some time, and now it's finally here. I know a few of you were rooting for two 2019s and then a 2021, but that's not how it works. 2020 is here, and there's no turning back. As Chairwoman McCormick noted, UOCAVA ballots have already gone out the door in New Hampshire, and as Secretary Kondos noted, more are headed out this week in states around the country. Today, we're going to discuss much of the work that's been done and continues to prepare for the 2020 election year. As you know, each state administers their elections in a somewhat different way. Similarly, it seems like each election is unique with a different story, and when it's all said and done. 2000, it goes somewhat without saying at this point, was Florida. 2004, Ohio. 2008 was high enthusiasm and turnout and a little bit of a break from talking about Florida and Ohio. 2012 was long lines. 2016 was foreign interference and cybersecurity. I would like to apologize for the non-presidential years. I, like voters too often do, neglected them. But I will recognize 2018 because it had high turnout and enthusiasm among voters, and that's relevant to this panel and our discussion today. I think it forecasts what we may see in 2020 and is certainly part of the story that will be told, but we don't know the full story of 2020 yet. What we know, and as we heard from Secretary Kondos and Ardwan, is that election officials around the country are preparing for all of the situations that I just mentioned and more. That is the nature of election administration, and an element that I believe does not receive the attention or credit it deserves. As you know, election administration is a 365-day-a-year job, and this year it found a way to be a 366-day job. That might be a cruel joke on election officials that leap year seems to fall on presidential election years, but maybe we need the time. The point is, there is no break. There are just times for doing different work. But now, again, 2020 is the presidential election year, and that's the time that most people pay attention and the most people show up. And for election administrators, the goal is to accommodate those voters and provide as smooth of an experience as possible, a positive election day that encourages future participation. I often see election administration covered or portrayed as a horse race, similar to politics. But it isn't, and it shouldn't be. Election administration done right is about good governance and customer service. This panel is here to talk about just that and all the work that goes into it. When it seems impossible to talk about it seems impossible to talk about elections these days without discussing security, we'll try to leave most of that out until the panel later today. There is an intersection that's important. All of the work that goes into security also should bolster Americans' confidence that their vote will be cast as counted and that participating is worthwhile. I know the secretaries on this panel have been doing impressive work in this area in their states and will share some thoughts on these issues. But our primary focus on this panel is what can be done to ensure a positive experience for voters in a year with potentially record-breaking turnout. I'm so pleased to moderate this panel that exemplifies the good governance and customer service I mentioned earlier. Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose and Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson have been doing great work individually in their states, but they've also been working together to promote civility, bipartisan cooperation in this area. I'd like to thank them for that work and for being here today, and I look forward to hearing from each of them. Tammy Patrick, really, what can you say? Just when I think I'm pretty far down the elections rabbit hole, I see Tammy, and she's got a flashlight, and she says, check this out. And I always learn something, and so before Currently, Tammy is a senior advisor at the Democracy Fund. Before that, she worked to help administer elections in Maricopa County, Arizona, and served on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration that investigated the line issues in 2012. I'm certain that Tammy's insights will allow us all to leave here today better informed and prepared. And then finally, Megan Kelly with the Federal Voting Assistance Program, or FVAP, is here. Just when you thought we were going to have a hard time squeezing all of this into an hour, Megan's here to remind us that there are uniformed and overseas citizens all over the world who need ballots too. I know the FVAP team is doing great work, and I look forward to discussing it. Thank you. Secretary LaRose.
Thank you, Commissioner, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. And as you said, the 2020 election cycle is already upon us. Here in Ohio, we're going to be sending out our overseas military ballots in 17 days. Our early voting begins in 36 days, and our March primary is in 63 days. And so for us, we are fully focused on making sure that Ohio will be ready and is ready when the eyes of the world are on us, as we anticipate. I've had the chance to travel to all 88 of our county boards of elections, and what I see actually gives me cause for a great optimism. And that is that this bipartisan enterprise of elections administration is something that most Americans don't realize. Sometimes it feels like here in Washington, Republicans and Democrats can't agree what day of the week it is. But at every county board of elections in Ohio and in most jurisdictions around the country, every morning, Republicans and Democrats come to work, unlock the door, turn on the lights, and do this really complex job of running elections. And so to start from that basis of understanding that this is something that we as Americans still do together in a bipartisan way, that's something that we all should be, happy about, and something in which we should take heart. Also, we anticipate it's going to be a high turnout. We know that in Ohio anyway, 2016 was our highest turnout election in our state's history. We followed that up in 2018 with the highest turnout gubernatorial election in our state's history. And so I fully anticipate that trend will continue, and I hope it will continue. I've got a little wager with my friend from Michigan we'll talk about later. But I hope that voter participation in Ohio is at an all-time high, and I hope that we have a record-breaking turnout once again in the state of Ohio in 2020. Some of the things that we're doing to make sure that we're ready for that, as you mentioned, the focus of today's panel is not security, but obviously that's part of the paradigm. Everything that we talk about in elections and everything that we focus on in elections has a security component to it, and it all should be aimed, as you mentioned, Commissioner, at reinforcing the confidence that voters have in our elections. And that's where our focus has been. I directed all 88 of our county boards of elections to complete an exhaustive 34-point checklist. I gave them until the end of this month. This is something I tasked them with about 7 months ago. And so we're on the sort of final days of implementing the security checklist that I've given to all 88 of our county boards of elections. Also happy that Ohio voted in our state legislature 2 years ago to fund $114.5 million in state money to field all new voting equipment, the most secure, state-of-the-art, and efficient equipment for the whole state. Of course, in Ohio, we require that every ballot have a paper backup. That's why we're able to do a full post-election audit, which I require of each of our boards of elections after each election. And in some cases in Ohio, we've been doing risk-limiting audits, which we're excited about. And then, of course, part of the work that we do to make sure that we're ready for 2020's election cycle and the high turnout is poll worker recruitment. We have focused in Ohio a lot on this and helping our boards of elections do this. We have a few innovative programs that we've been really trying to take full use of. One of those is Youth at the Booth. We have 17-year-olds that work as poll workers, and we've gone out to a lot of high schools. In fact, I went out to one this fall, and we helped them run their election for homecoming king and queen using real voting machines. It was a mock election that we ran, and then we signed up a bunch of them to be poll workers and got a lot of them registered to vote. So that's a lot of the work that we're doing, and I look forward to talking more about that with you and with the other panelists.
Thank you, Secretary LaRose. Secretary Benson.
Thanks. Well, hi, everyone. And as you can see, I'm very fortunate to be overseeing our elections in Michigan because in no small part, because I've got a great partner next door in Ohio, and we've been able to leverage our competitive friendship to, can I just talk about the bet? Because you already brought it up. Okay. to have a wager and being a Michigan fan and an Ohio State fan. to whichever state has higher turnout in 2020. The loser will have to sing the fight song for the opposing team at the Michigan-Ohio State football game, which incidentally is in Columbus in November, a few weeks after the election. So I feel like there's a lot more at stake for someone who's going to be singing the Michigan fight song in Columbus in November, as opposed to, I mean, no one's going to care if I show up in red and say so. But anyway.
Scarlet.
So we have, so we're having fun with it, but it reflects the partnerships that are so critical to ensuring that we all are prepared for 2020 and not just prepared for the high turnout, but incentivizing high turnout and engagement of all citizens across the state. And so I want to talk just briefly about what we're doing in Michigan on that, but I want to emphasize the importance of those partnerships at the federal level, among my colleagues, other secretaries of state, and at the local level. Michigan has over 1,500 local jurisdictions, all of which are running elections through independently elected clerks. We have Tina Barton here today, who is both a national leader and a local clerk in Michigan, and I'm fortunate to have great partnerships with our clerks like Tina and others around the state, because the rubber really meets the road at that local level, and those partnerships are critical. In addition to partnerships, though, what we found this year alone is how critical voter education is, and let me give you some examples of that. So the other aspect of Michigan that's very unique this year in 2020 is that this is the first year our state will be implementing a number of new constitutional protections, state constitutional protections, that voters enacted last November in 2018. I guess now, a little over a year ago. And those protections included both modernizing our election ability to register to vote for eligible citizens, and enabling eligible citizens to register to vote up to and on election day. And then secondly, allowing for automatic voter registration whenever a citizen who's eligible to register to vote comes into one of our branch offices. I also oversee all our licenses and essentially the DMV in the state of Michigan. They're automatically registered to vote if they're eligible to register. And ensuring that process is rolled out. I'm very proud that our new Director of Elections, Jonathan Brader in Michigan, oversaw that process last year, and just 5 months got us up to speed in securely implementing automatic voter registration. We also have online voter registration for the first time. So a number of new opportunities for individuals to register to vote. Secondly, we're now a vote by mail state, no reason absentee state. Every citizen has the right to be able to vote absentee or by mail. And so implementing that is key. And then also we have new security protections as well, including a mandate for meaningful post-election audits. And we've begun piloting throughout the past year and a half risk-limiting audits throughout the state of Michigan. But to focus on voter education and its critical, the critical importance of that, I want to emphasize a couple of statistics, but also what voter education really means to us in Michigan, which is more than the traditional ways, but really being proactive, meeting voters where they are, meeting citizens and new voters where they are, and engaging them in their homes, in their neighborhoods, educating them about the importance of civic engagement and their new rights in order to cast their ballots. For example, we've had 3 local elections in 2019 already in Michigan. What we saw in those elections were that when people heard about these new rights, they took advantage of them, and turnout increased. In a local May election, for example, in May 2019, over 400 people who were eligible to vote registered on election day and voted. Of those 400, over 300 were 18 and 19 years old. Fascinating, right? We saw those numbers in every single local election and can expect that next year, or this year, if they know about it, if young voters, if new citizens, if eligible citizens know about these protections. In addition to that, we saw turnout double in local precincts where they got mailings indicating they can now vote by mail. So voter education is key. And finally, collaboration. The importance of collaborating not just with other election officials, but also with our nonprofit partners, with community partners, is key. And I'll talk a little bit more, and maybe in the Q&A, about what we're doing there. But really, at the heart of collaboration is, as my colleague mentioned, the importance of bipartisanship in approaching how we administer elections, recognizing that we're all in this together. We all deserve to be focused on what's best for voters, all voters, and we, in everything that we do, make decisions in line with service, customer service, and ensuring our democracy is accessible and secure for everyone.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. Tammy Patrick.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Commissioner, for your kind words. I'm never quite sure what you're going to say, so I'm always on edge. And it's wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this panel, along with my esteemed colleagues. And it's great to see so many of you. I am riffing a little bit while they pull up my slides. Can you imagine that I, in fact, have a handful of slides? There we go. If you're guessing the over-under, we'll address that later on. But this is one of the shorter presentations. It's only about 5 minutes. But I wanted to really share with you some of my favorite things, right? So here we are. We're preparing for basically now. We're in the throes of it, as everyone has already mentioned. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the data and some of the tools that are available for election officials at the state and local level for your planning. The esteemed Charles Stewart at MIT came up with this great chart that I have titled the Elections Snow Globe, or Snow Globe of Elections. And what we're looking at here is the options in which voters have selected to vote. What voting method did they use? At the apex of this triangle is Tuesday, Election Day. On the lower side, stage right, left, on one side is vote by mail and one side is early in-person voting. And so what I wanted to show you is this slide deck very quickly, because it demonstrates that, in fact, when voters are given options, they choose not to vote entirely on Tuesday, Election Day. Over time, voters make other options in casting their ballot. So I love to go back and forth on this and just click back and forth and see the voters still participating in our elections, but choosing the options in which they're given. I moved back to 2016 and then to 2018 because you'll notice there's a little bit of a shift. In 16, in the presidential year, voters were really trickling down and selecting a variety of ways. I do want to point out that right there, smack dab in the middle, is Florida. A third of your voters do like to go on Tuesday. A third of them like to vote by mail, and a third of them like to vote early in person. And you're running 3 parallel elections, is what that basically says. What this is, though, is that we know we had an increase in turnout. So how do we contemplate how we service these voters as we move into the rest of the elections for this year? This is the other piece I wanted to share with you. So for years, CNN has done a survey of the electorate starting 600 days out. So what we're seeing here on the bottom is starting 600 days out, leading all the way up to Election Day. And they're asking voters, how enthusiastic are you for this election cycle? So at the very end, in all of those other elections, the highest point was Election Day, and it was less than 30%, up to right about 40% for some of the elections. So 2008, 2012, it was just under 40% of the voters said, I'm extremely enthusiastic. That circle part is now. Now, 600 days out, voters, 400 days out, 500 days out, voters are more enthusiastic than they were on Election Day in those other elections. So we talk about, perhaps anecdotally, we're hearing voters are coming. They are coming, and we're going to finally, any election official that's had a single-digit turnout election that is devastating, you put on the election and nobody shows up to your party, they're coming this time. So consider, how do we translate this enthusiasm into effectively cast ballots? How do we make sure that people who are interested in it are, in fact, participating effectively, and that we're keeping the lines moving? So I want to provide you with a couple of quick tools that are available out on the website for election officials and others. Caltech MIT provides 3 resource allocation tools that you can use, and it allows you to do things like plug in how many check-in sites you have. So look at the yellow here, and this is contemplating like a 90-second check-in, and you've got a handful of check-in sites. If anything changed in your election procedures or policies at the check-in, maybe you have a new electronic poll book, maybe you have a new ID procedure. Just a change of 30 seconds takes a 7-minute check-in to more than an hour-long wait. And the tools allow you to look and see how many positions you would need in order to reduce that wait time. Also, the Center for Technology and Civic Life also provides those resource allocation tools and 2 different applications that you can use. One is a free app that you can measure an estimated amount of time it'll be for a voter to vote a ballot. So you have X number of questions, X number of candidates. It allows you to do that. There's also an app that allows you how many to kind of estimate and capture how long it takes your voting process. So that's a good thing to do when you're having like poll worker training. And then the 2 last ones is the University of Rhode Island has a new project that was just published, the University URI Votes Project. And there's an additional tools available to help with the streamlining of your polling places to most effectively service your voters. And then lastly, for tens of millions of Americans, their ballots are handed to them not by a poll worker, but by their postal carrier. And so for those states that are seeing that increase in voters moving to the vote at home, vote by mail channel, you can sign up for the Postal Service Informed Visibility. It'll help track the information coming to you so you know how many ballots you should expect on any given day. So let's think about, as we talk today and as we move into this planning, have there been policy changes that are going to affect the formula you've used in the past? The formula you've always used to say, I need this many poll workers, this many check-ins. Consider if your policies have changed that, and then how are these additional options, how will the voters know? Oftentimes the resources have to be spent to accommodate the technological needs, but how are you going to explain to voters that they now have no excuse voting in Michigan? For places that move to no excuse from excuse, it's oftentimes about 1/3 of an uptick in voters choosing that option. So contemplate how these changes are going to affect the way in which voters have in fact. That was, you held up wrap up just as I hit it. Those are some tools that are out there. There are many, many more, and you can find out more about them on electionline.org.
Thank you, Tammy. And we are live streaming this, recording it, and we will have the PowerPoint slides on our website for those of you who want access to those great materials. Again, thank you, Tammy. And now, Megan Kelly.
Last but not least, and not that Megan Kelly, just for the record, obviously. I guess I should say that in this room. But I'm Megan. I'm with the Federal Voting Assistance Program within the Department of Defense. Thank you to the EAC for having us. I'm humbled to be on this panel with some of these people that I've looked up to for several years now in the elections process. For those of you who aren't familiar with our program, I work and our team works with military and overseas voters. So those are the voters that aren't going to show up on election day. They're going to start the process now, as we've already heard this morning. They are away from their jurisdiction. They're in other countries that are located around the world. Our job within the Federal Voting Assistance Program is to administer the UOCAVA federal law, that is the Uniformed Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. Long acronym, we love our acronyms in the federal government. But it's a great job, and what I usually like to talk to about election officials when it comes to high voter turnout is they're coming now. We have 3 major pushes when you talk about UOCAVA voters, or those military and overseas voters. And the first one is upon us. As several of the people have noted this morning, there's a 45-day requirement that those UOCAVA ballots must go out to our voters. And so that's upon us. If you start talking about primary elections, that's here. Many of our military and overseas voters have already started requesting their ballots or registering to vote to get them good to go for this 2020 election year. So we see a huge influx of military and overseas voters come at this first of the year. That means for you election officials in the room, they're going to be calling you, they're going to be emailing you, they're going to have questions, they're going to call it a weird time because they're 9, 10, 12 hours ahead of us. They're going to need a lot of help. We have found that our UOCAVA voters, they don't have a huge network of support. If they're military, they can often go to their military installation voting office for support, or if they're just an overseas civilian, they can go to their embassy, but that's it. So a lot of times they either have to call our program, the Federal Voting Assistance Program, or call a local election official. The good news is, though, if they can ask the question and they ask you for help, 93% of them will then go on to request their ballot and return it. So once they get to a place where they can get some help, we see huge numbers of people actually then participating in the voting process and returning their ballots. So the first push is upon us. Here we go. Now we'll see a lull in the summertime. It will die off. And then come August and September, we start our major marketing pushes to say, hey, UOCAVA voters, you got to start now to allow for all of that mail time that goes into the process of absentee voting. So we do another major push in August to say, get registered. If you want to participate in the presidential election, now is the time to request your ballot so it gets to you in enough time. I do want to note that the Federal Voting Assistance Program isn't a get out the vote. We are not measured. Congress does not ask us how many military overseas voters that we register to vote. We are simply a resource for them that if they choose to do so, they know that they have a program they can go to for support. And that's kind of just an introduction. So we have 3 major pushes, spring and then late in the fall, and then that 45-day deadline, and then happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Megan. While Chairwoman McCormick mentioned a desire for folks to ask questions, I will take this moderator's privilege to mention that Secretary LaRose talked about poll workers and poll worker recruitment. I do want to give a plug for those of you in the audience or watching the live stream who don't have to work on Election Day because you're an election administrator. Please really consider being a poll worker. I've done it in Missouri when I lived there, and then in Maryland. Unbelievably rewarding experience. And now is a great time to look into it because election officials would love for you to participate as a poll worker in the primaries before the general. So please, if you've ever thought about being a poll worker, consider that. That's my plug for poll working. And now I'll get to a couple questions. One specifically that I'd wanted to ask for the secretaries. Seeing Tammy's slides and the snow globe, if you will, do you all anticipate, I know Secretary Benson, you mentioned no excuse absentee is new to Michigan, and Secretary LaRose, we know that you've always, or Ohio for quite some time, has had a lengthy early voting period. But if you could both talk about how you anticipate seeing that sort of lessen the challenge of Election Day, that would be great.
Well, I'll say 2 things on that, but preface it by saying with the poll worker piece, we are actually trying to, in Michigan, partner with law firms, local businesses, large corporations to give their employees the day off to serve as poll workers. So if there's anyone watching who has that idea, or anyone who has a number, we're actually even talking with professional sports teams about giving their employees the day off to serve as poll workers. We see it as a workforce development challenge, a talent challenge, and we've been proactively working to partner with organizations that have talented individuals and schools and universities as well, of course, to partner with us in providing that talent to serve our citizens on Election Day. But on voting by mail and absentee voting, it's both. It is a wonderful thing in Michigan. I was going to say it's a blessing and a curse, but it's not. It's a wonderful thing because we've already seen in the 3 local elections that we've had citizens from young voters to older voters taking advantage of this opportunity in many local jurisdictions. I mentioned Clerk Barton's here. I know in her local jurisdiction she saw 80% of people in a local election in August and November returning or choosing to vote by mail. So it's a wonderful thing. We're also seeing precincts. We have an Ottawa County Clerk, Justin Roebuck, who actually did a mailing to every single voter registered to vote in one of the precincts in a local election, giving them information on how to request their absentee ballot or vote from home. And we saw turnout double, go from 12% to 25% in a local school board election where that one piece of voter education happened. So we're seeing voter education is critical. We're also seeing colleges step up. We want to have drop boxes on every college campus in Michigan so that young or that students can get their absentee ballot, vote, and drop it off. And then we can partner with the local clerk to ensure those ballots get where they're supposed to be and are counted. We're also looking at ballot tracking mechanisms as well to ensure that voter confidence piece is key. But I want to emphasize one of our biggest challenges, and that I know keeps many of us up at night, is that many of Michigan's statutes have not yet updated to match this new right that voters have in Michigan to be able to vote absentee without having to state a reason. Essentially what I mean by that is that in Michigan you cannot start counting absentee ballots or mailed-in ballots until the polls close on Election Day. So that works if a third of the citizens or a third of the voters are casting ballots that way and 2/3 are voting and having their ballots counted at precinct. It doesn't work if those numbers flip and you have 2/3, which I'm anticipating, of citizens voting from home this year, having those ballots sent to a centralized location and having absentee voting counting boards in many situations counting those ballots. If they're not able to begin even processing those ballots, as the law currently says in Michigan, until late on Election Day, we are going to have a situation where our election results are not ready when they typically are. And what that means and what I I am determined to ensure does not happen, but we're recognizing that this is a perfect storm that could create it, is we don't want Michigan to be the last state reporting on Election Day in 2020, and we certainly don't want to be the Florida or the Ohio of 2020. So that's what's at stake. And we're hoping that the state legislature makes this simple change to the law. We know the governor will support it to ensure that our clerks, our hardworking clerks, can process ballots sooner and more effectively and efficiently and securely, as opposed to have to wait under the current laws. But that's certainly one of my biggest concerns about this year's elections in Michigan, and why I would say it's a tremendous thing that citizens can now, and they will, be voting by mail, be voting absentee more than ever. And we just want to make sure the infrastructure is ready for that.
Thank you.
So if I may start also on the poll worker recruitment thing, and a little shameless plug for any Ohioans that are interested in doing so. Not only do we do the Youth at the Booth program, and what a cool thing to have on a college application that you were an elections official at 17 years old, but also that we call it Day for Democracy, where we're encouraging companies to give, and state entities, county, local government entities, to give their folks a day off to work the polls. We have a website set up for that, ohiosos.gov/defenddemocracy, where people can sign up to be a poll worker. And then also, I've been working to try to encourage veterans groups. I'm a veteran, and so I remind, every time I get the chance to speak at a veterans group, I remind them that they took an oath, maybe a few years ago, maybe a few decades ago, but they took an oath to preserve and protect the Constitution and to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And one way that they can continue to keep that lifelong commitment is by working as a poll worker. Making sure that we have ample opportunities for Ohioans to cast their ballot has always been a focus of ours in the state. And we're really proud of the fact that we've been a leader in the nation with 28 days of early voting, with vote by mail, with in-person voting before the elections, also for 28 days, and including weekend and evening hours. We have Sunday afternoon voting. We're one of only, I think, 6 states in the nation that offer Sunday afternoon early voting. I think we're one of only 20 states that have Saturday in-person early voting. And so these are things that we pride ourselves on in Ohio. But one of the things that I'm going to be doing this year, and has been done in the past, is I'm going to be sending an absentee ballot request to every registered voter in Ohio. We want to see people take advantage of that convenience. As we all know, it helps reduce the pressure on our polling locations on election day, so that we don't have long lines and that kind of thing. But also, and I remind people this is when I'm pitching people on why they should vote by mail, I tell them it's like being able to cheat on the test. You always run into those folks that say, I just don't know all these candidates for judge, and I just don't know all of these sort of down ticket candidates. And I tell them, do what my grandmother does. She gets her laptop out and she sits there with her vote by mail ballot and she researches every last one of them. And if one of them doesn't have a website, she calls me up and says, Frankie, tell me about Judge so-and-so, because she wants to be a very informed voter. So if you're worried about not having all of that committed to memory before you walk into the voting booth, being able to vote by mail is a great way to be a very informed voter, and it only takes you, maybe a half hour to sit at your kitchen table and get that done. So that's something that we're making sure that, and the numbers show that in Ohio we've been enjoying that opportunity to cast early ballots. In 2018 it was 1.4 million. 2016 we had 1.9 million. I anticipate that number will go higher. I certainly hope that number will go higher this year, and that's it's something that we're working to encourage every way we can.
Great, thank you. And for those of you that want to hear more about poll workers, stay tuned. This afternoon, Commissioner Palmer is leading a panel that I'm sure will get into that more. But for now, we'll move on. Tammy Patrick, I had wanted to ask you, I know that, so Tammy was on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which you may remember from their awesome report. I think that is widely accepted at this point, that it was great. But really, that whole commission started around lines. And one of the things that I remember was that as they went into the process, what they really discovered that most of those line issues were really downstream issues. And so before I get there, I'll give another shameless plug. Those issues had to do with voter registration. And so if people at home or here, if you have not updated your registration or registered, great idea to do that. I recently moved counties and needed to update my registration. I did so at the DMV, but there's a lot of choices out there. So again, update your registration, make sure it's current. That will resolve a lot of problems on Election Day and help the poll workers that we just mentioned. But anyway, so Tammy, if you could talk a little bit more about what you saw on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration and some of these issues that may be relevant to the high turnout that we are anticipating for 2020.
Absolutely, and thank you for the kind words about the report. We worked very hard on it. Part of what was interesting about the Presidential Commission on Election Administration is that it was very different from other commissions in that we had 6 months to, as then President Obama said, to fix that, the long lines that occurred. And what we found is we traveled around the country and held hearings everywhere from Miami to Anchorage, San Francisco to Philadelphia. We had meetings all across the country. Was that at that time we really didn't have anyone doing sound data collection on how long are the lines, where are the lines forming. And here we are in the National Press Club, and any election official in the room has received the call from the local elections beat reporter that says, where are the lines? I want to go get a picture of the lines. Where is it happening? And I think that one of the challenges that we have created this understanding that a line is a bad thing, when in fact a line that does not move is a bad thing. I moved from Arizona to Maryland, and the first time I went to vote early in person, because we don't have a permanent early voting list for me to get on, which is how I voted in Arizona, I got there and there was this big long line, and I thought, oh, here we go. Wow, we didn't fix anything. It took me less than 20 minutes to vote, to get in line. Huge line of people, but it was moving quickly, it was well processed, I've cast my ballot and was done in 20 minutes. So as we move into this year, I think we need to think about the whole question of lines, and because we probably will see lines with that kind of turnout. The question will be, if a person is standing in line for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 12 hours, that is unconscionable in the United States of America. So one of the things that has happened since the Commission's report came out is we did a comprehensive review of the entire kind of elections systems, things like voter registration. We've seen huge advances in the number of states that have joined ERIC, so we have more accurate voter lists. We have more states that are doing online voter registration, automatic voter registration. So we know that there are a lot of the systemic challenges that have created lines in the past have been addressed. And that's not to say that there isn't going to be a machine that jams. In the midterms, we had situations where election officials know that it's always something. In Florida, they know that humidity can affect paper. When we had the hurricanes hitting the eastern seaboard, there were a lot of machines jamming all the way up New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, because it was so humid from the hurricanes that paper was swelling and it was jamming as it was going through the machines. So think about when we hear issues that arise on Election Day or at early voting centers or in vote centers on Election Day, ballot malfunction, immediately everyone is in this environment going to think, oh, we've been hacked, there's some problem. It could be that the paper has swollen slightly because it's humid. It could be human error. We have to make sure that we all keep very level heads moving into this cycle. And I'm really fortunate, as we were talking today, heard from both the secretaries this morning and the secretaries on this panel, many of the things that they're articulating, like the poll worker programs, advances in offering additional options to voters in how they engage in the franchise, many of those things were part of our very practical recommendations in the report. So I think that we need to kind of rethink how we think about lines moving forward, how we talk about lines. I've conducted elections where there were no lines at all because there were no voters. And we had 3% turnout, at the polls themselves. And so I think that that's something to really think about, the language that we're using, the language we use in our news reports, how we articulate things to our voters to make sure that we're setting them up for the right expectations, and then also giving them the tools they need to effectively participate.
Thank you, Tammy. Megan, I had wanted to ask, I know that after the MOVE Act, election officials have gotten much better at getting ballots out the door because they have to, but also because they're doing a great job. And one of the things I feel like I've been hearing more about is the challenge of having voters return those in a timely fashion. Maybe they're receiving the ballot with plenty of time, but they're like many of us, procrastinating. And so have you heard of any techniques that some election officials are using to sort of encourage that quick return to make sure it does get back in time?
Yeah, so I think I've heard the buzzword a couple times this morning, customer service. I think we all brushed it off, but with our voters, when we start talking about the voters that we deal with, those UOCAVA voters, right, they may get their ballot early and then it sits on the dining room table for 3 weeks. And then all of a sudden it gets buried under a pile of mail and they realize, oh, whatever, I need to vote and hurry up and get this in the mail. And some of that human kind of habit we can't correct, but customer service kicks in from the election official. If the election official knows who they sent their UOCAVA ballots to 45 days in advance, even just sending a simple email, don't forget to return your UOCAVA ballot. This is the deadline. Please get it in the mail by X date. You have the buffer after the election day. Many states have 3, 4, even sometimes up to 10 days after the election day to receive those overseas ballots. Simply sending an email out. We already have their emails. One of the great things that the MOVE Act did is it allowed election officials to send that blank ballot to a UOCAVA voter by email. So now it's populating into their Gmail or Hotmail account, and they may see it a little bit more faster than if they were to receive the paper ballot and it sits on the dining room table for 3 weeks. So I think just that customer service when it comes to UOCAVA voters is really essential in that. So just pushing them along, sending them a reminder email, don't forget to get your UOCAVA ballot back. These are your allowances, these are your benefits. States differ on how they can send their UOCAVA ballots back. So just an election official just doing that extra step, going that extra mile on customer service really makes a difference in getting those military and overseas ballots back.
Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for audience questions. We've got some EAC staff with microphones. I will say I'm a big fan of keeping on time, so we're going to try to do that. But if there's anyone that has a question for the audience, I think we've got time for a few. And if people want to continue to think about, oh, we've got one.
Morning. Was wondering about this concept of customer service. I actually was a campaign staffer in 2012 in Miami when we saw the lines being 8 and 12 hours long under the humidity, and so you can imagine Florida's kind of hot. So while we had the folks waiting, we did our best to feed the folks on the line, give them music, just try to make it a little bit more upbeat than, just waiting under the sun. I was wondering, do you folks see that aspect of that customer service of helping the folks on the lines as more of an election administration space where maybe the elections officials can do a better job helping those folks, or do you see that more of a nonprofit partners and campaign space where they can take over that particular aspect of customer service?
I think it's 100% about collaboration. I think everyone has a responsibility in this space to ensure that we're moving the lines quickly and that voters are having a good experience. And where we've had the most success in Michigan, it's where we've been able to partner with community organizations that and I'm talking, I would emphasize nonpartisan community organizations that have credibility in communities that a state government official may not, and so which is also important to ensuring that that you don't have the force of state government coming in and being too heavy-handed. But at the same time, that collaboration is important, and those partnerships are important to build now, so that when that comes, we can identify the best way of responding to a particular challenge, be it a long line or something else, in that locality. And I'll just underscore that by saying, prior to becoming Secretary of State, one of the things I did was work with many nonpartisan organizations running voter protection efforts throughout Michigan. And now we're going to, in the Michigan Secretary of State's office, have our own voter protection effort, partnering with nonpartisan voter protection efforts so that we're in collaboration and coordination, but utilizing our office in a way that's helpful to either move along the lines or solve other problems that happen on Election Day. But that partnership is key.
Partnership is key, and obviously the focus is on making sure that we don't have long lines, or that the lines move as quickly as we can. As far as giving folks the opportunity to get in out of the sun or get in under a shade area or whatever else, that's the kind of coordination that those local boards of elections should be doing to plan for that kind of thing, especially with the early voting lines. And that's what we see in the weekend before the election. Folks had 28 days of early voting in Ohio, but oftentimes they wait until the last 2 or 3 days to actually go to the Board of Elections or their early voting site to do that. One of the best things that can be happening as they're standing in line is to have the elections officials circulating with the clipboards to get them, ready to go, so that when they get up there, everything's all filled out and they just go straight through the process. And so obviously our focus is on making sure that we manage that process in a way that's a good experience for the voters and that we keep those lines moving.
And if I could just add to that real quickly, I think that's spot on. And another reason why it has to be a collaboration is because of the electioneering line limits where you can't be past that. So I think election officials or legislators that are thinking about limiting cell phone use while voters are standing in line to vote. It's one thing once you get into a polling place, there's a lot of them that have that, but I've seen legislation where it prevents someone from using their telephone while they're standing in line, and that just makes everyone irritable when you can't have your phone at the end of your arm all day long, right? So I think, and some of them are going to be looking up information on candidates. One of the things that we saw when the PCA was at Disney is that if you give people things to do, like having the local high school marching band come, or you have these other things, having a selfie station that they can take their picture on their way in to vote, so that it's not being done in the polling place for those places that prevent that sort of thing. There are a lot of things that can be done to to really celebrate the act of voting.
That's great. One thing I'd add, again, if you can mention your name and affiliation, if it's relevant, we'd appreciate that. I believe.
Hello.
Tina. Oh, sorry.
Good morning. Honored to see my Secretary of State here, so thank you. But one of the most critical partners that I think in this whole thing is the Postal Service. And as we're seeing this year as we go along, the increased turnout that we're expecting in 2020, I'd like to hear the ideas. I know we've done some things in Michigan. Maybe Secretary Benson wants to talk about our envelopes, something along those lines. But what are we doing to make sure, excuse me, across the country that we have partnered with the Postal Service to make sure that the ballots are getting to us in time? If your ballot's not to me by 8 p.m. on Tuesday night, I can't count your ballot on Wednesday in Michigan. And so I'd like to hear, we're doing lots of things and lots of partnerships with other groups. They have to be a strong partner with us in order for this election to be fair for everyone and to know that their ballots have been counted. And I'd like to talk about that.
So we partner very closely with our postmasters and our Postal Service personnel. They're always invited to our elections officials conferences that happen twice annually. And then we do things like ballot tracking, where we have that opportunity for Ohioans to track that their ballot has been received. This is the world that we're all accustomed to. We all track when our packages are coming from our favorite online retailer. We should be able to track our ballots too. We have that in Ohio, and I've proposed, and I think that it's time that the state pays the postage on the return ballot. That dollars worth of postage is not going to be the deciding factor probably for somebody voting or not voting, but what often happens is there's confusion. Is it a single stamp? Is it 2 or 3 stamps? How many do I need to put on there? And then every Board of Elections that I've visited, they have their wall of shame where somebody has put 100 1-cent stamps on the envelope just because they're angry, or somebody even taped 4 quarters to an envelope and put it in the mail once. So we can just eliminate that and have the state pay the cost of that postage as a bulk rate that we would do. One other thing that I'm proposing and want to see get done is for that absentee ballot request to be online. Right now you have to print out a piece of paper, fold it up, mail it in to request your absentee ballot. I would like to see that process put online in Ohio, and we have proposed that in the legislature.
So I could talk about this all day long, but I'll keep it very brief. The Postal Service has committed designated staff specifically for election mail. So we have Dan Bentley, who is your election mail coordinator globally, nationally. The Deputy Postmaster General is committed to this. But for any election official, you'll want to do a couple of things. One, if you just Google election mail at USPS, you'll get an entire election mail page that included in it is a map You can click on your state and it'll tell you who your election mail coordinator is for the Postal Service, who is your regional supervisor for the Postal Service, and it'll also provide you all the information on the design requirements and parameters for the envelopes that you're using for your ballots, both outbound and return. You want to make sure that you're having those envelopes reviewed by the Postal Service so that as it goes through the mail stream, it doesn't cause any problems. In addition to that, it was great to hear the ballot tracking is something that we are really moving forward in a lot of places across the country. Every voter in the country pretty much can subscribe to something called informed delivery. And basically what happens is you get an email that every morning tells you what's going to be in your mailbox. So they'll see if in fact their ballot is supposed to arrive that day, and that gives a new level of security when they know that it's supposed to be in their mailbox, and then if it isn't, they're going to call you, right, as an election official. And then also things that election officials can do is for those of you who are in-hand states, meaning you have to have the ballot in your possession at the close of the polls on election day, talk to your local postmasters and talk to them about something called caller service. Caller service allows for you to go to the Postal Service and pick up your ballots without them having to be delivered to you because then they might be too late. So there are things, there's a report that was done in 2016 called The New Realities of Voting by Mail, and it lays out some of these things both for election officials to think about, for voters to think about, legislators to think about in terms of aligning those deadlines so that you have time to process the ballots coming in, as well as for the Postal Service. And the Postal Service has made changes and implemented some things for us. So you want to make sure you're using the tracking and the intelligent mail barcode, including something that they did new this time, and that is a ballot tracking piece to it. So it's called a service type ID, and you want to make sure that you're using that so in the event of any sort of catastrophe or disaster, a plane is impacted, a truck is impacted, we'll be able to know exactly how many ballots are part of that situation.
Thank you, Tammy, and I'd really like to thank the audience for that question because there's literally nothing like a postal question that can prove my introduction to Tammy as being completely right. So anyway, I would like to thank our panel and ask you to join me in thanking them. We're going to take a short break now. We'll be back at 11:10. There is coffee and water in the lobby. And at 11:10, we will resume with remarks from Shelby Pearson, who's the Election Threats Executive for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We will see you at 11:10. Thank you.